Hello, and welcome back for another episode of Leadership that Liberates. Today's topic is all around how we are conditioned to be good, what it means to be a good person, what it means to do good things in the world, and where is our sense of goodness coming from. And the thing is that we've often internalized what goodness means through systems of harm. And so the ways in which we act out or maybe even perform goodness inadvertently creates harm. We harm ourselves and we harm others through our desire to do good. But it's because our perception of good has come from a harmful system. And so we're going to talk about that. How is goodness, the ways in which we are taught to be good, how are they actually derived from systems of oppression? And how are they then playing out in our lives in ways that are self-oppressive and in ways that unintentionally suppress or repress other people and their agency and their autonomy? And we're going to look how this plays out through the shadows of martyrdom and saviorism, which is when goodness kind of becomes distorted. It's something I have been reflecting on and I think is really relevant to this topic is that my intention with bringing these things up and talking about these things is not to reinforce shame. Because the reason these parts of ourselves are living in the shadow is because of shame in the first place. I do not want to reinforce or encourage any kind of self-judgment or self-blame, because also the ways in which we perform goodness are very much a way to combat our deep-seated belief that we're actually bad. So I never intend to tell you you're bad. When I talk about the ways in which we have internalized systems of oppression, to the extent that we are then unconsciously repeating and perpetuating systems of harm, that is not to say, look how bad we are. Look at all of the reasons, all of the additional reasons that you should feel bad about who you are, that you should think that you are a bad person, that you should judge yourself or blame yourself or criticize yourself or loathe yourself. Please, 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 don't ever take anything I'm saying as justification for more self-harm. My intention, my desire with bringing these things up and with trying to create more awareness is simply so that we have more choice in how we move through life, so that we, through our awareness of our conditioning, can choose agency, autonomy, sovereignty, care, connection, community, so that we have more choice in choosing ways that honor our humanity and honor other people's humanity. It is not to say we are bad, but it's to bring attention and awareness to the ways in which we have internalized the belief that we are bad to the point that we do harmful things in the world because of our inability to be with the discomfort and the pain that is brought up through the harm we've internalized and therefore unconsciously perpetuate. So it just feels really important to say that. I am never ever sharing any of this from a place of judgment or criticism. And it is never ever meant to be a reason that you judge or criticize yourself. My intention is not to make you feel bad or to create shame. I am simply trying to create more awareness for us so that we can make choices that honor our humanity. So let's talk about where we learn goodness. We are absorbing messages about what it means to be good and do good through systems like religion. And I'm calling religion a system of oppression in this context because of the ways in which religious messages have been distorted and used as a tool for oppression. Not because religion in and of itself is inherently oppressive, but it has been used to oppress. And so that is why I want to talk about it as a system of harm in this context, right? So that's one place where we learn what it means to be good. We learn what it means to be good through colonialism and neocolonialism and the principles upon which colonialism happened. We learn it through the patriarchy and gendered perceptions of good or bad. We learn this through capitalism and what it means to be successful or create success. And so let's break each of these down a little bit. First of all, we have religion, and I am going to speak specifically to a Christian worldview or framework because it is upon this Christian framework that colonialism was founded on. So, a lot of the justification for colonialism was rooted in Christian values. And maybe not values, so to say, but again, like distortions of Christianity. And this idea that people need to be saved and that there needs to be a savior who saves those people. It's kind of hard actually to separate religion and colonialism in this conversation because the two are so deeply intertwined in the ways in which we have been taught about goodness. So, of course, you have this idea within Christianity of a savior, Jesus as the savior of humanity. But then what you have through colonialism was this justification of colonizing peoples because supposedly it was the white man's burden to save those people, to save the people who did not know Jesus and who were not already exposed to this worldview or this framework. And so a lot of what we think is good is actually this saviorism playing out of we need to fix people. We need to show them the way. We need to teach them how to do something. There is an innate, inherent sense of superiority present in saviorism. Even if we're not consciously thinking that we are better than someone else, this is playing out in the ways that we try to fix things or people. We have the answers. This is why we insert ourselves into people's lives. We insert ourselves because we know better somehow. And along with that saviorism, there is then also martyrdom, because not only was Jesus a savior of humanity, but he martyred himself for humanity. So we also internalize that to be good, we have to be martyrs. We have to self-sacrifice. So then selflessness and self-sacrifice are an emulation of Jesus, or they are a marker of piety, of righteousness, of devotion, of faithfulness. So I have to martyr myself to be a good person. And we can see how this plays out in our lives, especially, let's say, in people working in the helping professions, educators, teachers, therapists, social workers. Martyrdom is very much internalized in these fields because we are wanting to do good and to help people. And obviously, there's also a little bit of saviorism in that too, because we think that we can save people. And again, this is when our goodness is kind of going into the shadow. Not that these things are inherent to doing good things or trying to help people, but it's when we are unable to see the ways in which we're overextending or overgiving in ways that are self-extractive or strip other people of their agency or autonomy through saviorism. Martyrdom is self-extractive in that it is harmful to the self, and saviorism is exploitative in the sense that it doesn't honor another person's agency or autonomy. That there needs to be a savior or a hero who comes in and fixes the situation or solves the problem or offers a solution. So we see in helping professions that people are overworked and they're overgiving and they're undervalued. And so martyrdom is at play in the ways in which we try to help at the expense of ourselves. And this ties into capitalism because through capitalism, we learn that goodness is hustling, overworking, overextending. That is how you succeed. That success requires martyrdom because success requires self-sacrifice. And rest then is frivolous. It's a luxury. Play is a luxury. Pleasure is self-indulgent. And again, we can see how this is playing out for people in helping professions. And because through all of these, we internalize this belief that it's also wrong or bad to be paid, for good work because we are anti-capitalistic in our values. But then that leads to guilt and shame around making money. And so we think the ways in which we have to be good require us, again, to martyr ourselves, to self-sacrifice, to work without compensation. But that's because we live in societies that don't value human-centered, community-centered work, which is the kind of work that teachers, educators, therapists, social workers, this is the kind of work that they are doing. It is heart-centered, community-led, connection-focused. But because our society doesn't honor, doesn't value those qualities or those ways of orienting to life, that's reflected in the way those people are typically compensated. And so we also internalize that we shouldn't be compensated for the work that we're doing because we should be martyring ourselves to do good work, to be good people. And of course, then there is the influence of the patriarchy as well. And when I talk about the patriarchy, of course, the patriarchy is rooted in a clear gender binary. So we're talking about men and women, or the masculine and the feminine, and the expectations around that, which are also tied to and rooted in religion. And that's not to say that there isn't any nuance in that, or that there aren't people who don't fit into the binary, absolutely. But in the way that this paradigm has been presented to us, in the way that this system operates, it operates on the basis of the binary: male, female, masculine, feminine, men, women. And within this patriarchal paradigm, what does it mean to be a good woman? A good woman sacrifices. A good woman takes care of her partner, her husband, her family, her children at the expense of herself. She is selfless in her service to others. Therefore, a good woman is a good martyr. And the expectations that we have on men, or the masculine, within the paradigm of patriarchy are that the man is the protector. And what does the protector do? He solves, he fixes, he saves those who are powerless and helpless, who are usually the women. And that's like an overemphasis on rationality and logic. And so there's a disconnection from emotion. You often find, right, that someone who is maybe feeling very emotional and expressing themselves in a very emotionally vulnerable way is then met with somebody else's desire to fix or solve their problem. When the person is just saying, hey, I just want to be witnessed in what I'm feeling. I don't need you to fix it. I don't need a solution. I don't need a resolution. I just want you to hear me. But the problem solver, the fixer, the hero, the savior cannot meet that emotion with attunement or with presence because they need to fix or to save or to problem solve. But this for us is what it means to be good. This is how we think we are being good people. And in many ways, that is a performance of goodness. Because what's happening with martyrdom and saviorism is that on the surface, there is goodness, but the shadow side of that, why are we needing to perform goodness in this way? That's in our shadow. So on the surface, the martyrs, they are presenting as selfless, as helpful, as humble, admirable, altruistic, committed to a cause, devoted to service. They're empathetic, they're caring, they're compassionate. And when this is taken too far, it leads to those people neglecting their own needs or allowing themselves to be taken advantage of in some way. And with the savior archetype, someone who is performing saviorism, on the surface, they are protective, they are supportive, they're the problem solver, the solution finder, the change maker. They're advocating for other people. They're intervening in times of challenge or need, and again, because they're empathetic or compassionate. But what we can see when this is taken too far is that they're overly intrusive, or they're imposing their help on others without consent. And so this is why you can see that martyrdom is often self-extractive, and saviorism can often become exploitative. But what's happening under the surface, the unconscious needs or desires that are driving being good in this way? These are the parts of self that are in the shadow, the parts of self that perform goodness in this way because they actually desire attention or recognition or validation because there is a need for approval, for acceptance. Folks are motivated by shame or by guilt. And again, many of the ways that we are performing goodness are in an attempt to counter or cover up the fact that we actually believe we're really bad. And we believe that we're really bad because of the ways in which we've been shamed in the past. And we are trying to compensate for our badness through our performance of goodness. And so, in many ways, saviorism or martyrdom actually reflect a lack of self-worth or worth that is based on being of service because we don't believe we're inherently worthy of love and acceptance as we are, but for what we do, for what we give, for how we show up in the world in ways that are useful, in ways that are productive, which again are rooted in capitalism. We need to earn love. Again, capitalistic values. And these dynamics also lead to codependency and enmeshment because we become entangled with other people. And this is where our sovereignty then is sacrificed, and so is the sovereignty of the other. Because through these dynamics are an inherent lack of boundary or limitation. And of course, culturally, boundaries, they don't really exist in certain cultures. Like in Greece, for example, that's like not even a concept of a boundary. Some kind of limit where I have my own agency and so do you. I am sovereign and so are you. That implies some level of limitation around the extent to which I impose myself on you or I allow you to impose yourself on me. Because again, to impose ourselves on another, there is within that almost like an assumption that they lack agency or autonomy. There's almost an assumption that someone else is powerless or helpless. And so through our imposition, we think we're saving, we're fixing, we're helping. But what's actually happening is we are removing that person's agency or autonomy to act in their own sovereignty. I was in conversation with a friend of mine recently who I have done a birth chart reading for her. And she really comes from past life patterns of being in service, of taking vows of poverty. And this very much shows up in her life now as self-extraction and as overextension. And she said something like, oh, sometimes to help other people, I have to harm myself. And that is this programming, this conditioning that we absorb through religious frameworks, whether or not we're religious, because they're intertwined with colonial frameworks, which are intertwined with capitalistic frameworks, which are intertwined with patriarchy. And so we have internalized that if I am to be good and to help other people, it has to come at my own expense. And that's just not true. We can honor ourselves and each other in the ways that we show up in the world. Because again, it's like, what choices would honor my humanity and your humanity? I do not have to honor your humanity at the expense of my own humanity. And I do not have to choose my own humanity at the expense of yours. It doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and. So I have a friend, Minachi, and Minachi has written a book called Decolonizing Nonviolent Communication. And basically, she had started studying nonviolent communication and saw that so many of the approaches within that practice are very Western, right? They're very much coming from a framework that is designed around the norms and values of the global North. And so she wrote this book, Decolonizing Nonviolent Communication. How do we think about approaching ourselves and others in ways that are not colonial or neo-colonial? And so I'd recently seen this quote from her book that was shared online. She shared it on her social media. And I had saved it because I thought this is really powerful. And then I shared it with this friend of mine who had said, sometimes helping other people requires that I harm myself, which again is not true. But I think that the way that she framed this, and this relates to boundaries, and I think it's a really beautiful framing. So this person they had posted something on social media about Minachi's work, and they had said, one of my favorite quotes on boundaries comes from Decolonizing Nonviolent Communication by Minachi. It goes, quote, boundaries are not a denial of someone's needs. They are an investment in the belief that other resources exist to meet those needs and that we do not need to be everything for everyone, unquote. And then this person who shared Minachi's quote says, I am working on a project and wanted to rewrite the quote for the other side of this. And so their rewritten version of the quote is, quote, a person setting boundaries with us is not a denial of our needs. They are an invitation to us to have faith in the belief that other resources exist to meet our needs and trust in our ability to honor what someone genuinely wishes to be for us, end quote. And so I think that saviorism and martyrdom and the ways in which we are conditioned to be good people are very rooted in these colonial, individualistic, capitalistic frameworks that center the self. And it may sound like when I'm talking about sovereignty and agency and autonomy that I'm also talking about self-centering, but I'm not. Because when we can honor our own sovereignty, humanity, agency, autonomy, that is why we then can honor it of others and why we can co-create in community and support one another through community. Because we are not operating from scarcity. Nature is abundant, life is abundant. Scarcity has been created through capitalistic frameworks. So I'm not enough, I can't do enough, I can't be enough, I can't give enough. That's where this self-extraction and this martyrdom and this saviorism comes from, because we are trying to overcompensate for our perceived inherent lack, which doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist for the other person either. That's why we show up in support and solidarity, not in saviorism and self-extraction, because I trust that you do not need me to save you or fix you, because there are infinite number of resources available to us, because community exists to support us. And we do not need to be everything to everyone, because again, that is a belief that is rooted in lack, not enoughness, not being enough, not having enough, that enough doesn't exist, which is not the case. So in many ways, saviorism is rooted in this unconscious belief that the other is not enough, while martyrdom is rooted in this unconscious belief that we ourselves are not enough. And so all of this is rooted in scarcity. And the world was colonized around scarcity and superiority, saviorism and martyrdom. And of course, we're not only internalizing these ways of being and moving through the world through systems, but through our ancestry, through our ancestors, through our lineage and generational patterns, and the ways in which those who came before us internalized these things and taught them to us. And this is why it's so important, as I always talk about, that we then are the ones who break the cycles, who identify the ways in which these things play out in our own lives, so that we don't repeat them and teach them to those who come after us. And again, as with everything that lives in the shadow, its purpose is protective. These are self-protective mechanisms. And so I have a few questions that you can consider, reflect on for yourself. First is, which of these do you most identify with? The savior or the martyr? How do you see that showing up in your own life through your own relationships and dynamics and the ways that you engage with people? What patterns do you notice around martyrdom or saviorism or both? And what beliefs or experiences are those patterns rooted in? Where does your belief that to be good, you have to martyr yourself or you have to save someone? Where does that come from? Where have you seen that? Or how have you learned those patterns? A lot of us learn self-sacrificing, martyr-like, self-extractive patterns if we are in close relationship to someone who is exploitative and someone who controls or manipulates, because we learn people pleasing as self-protection, and people pleasing often takes the extreme of self-sacrifice and martyrdom. But that's how we stay safe. It's to be hyper attuned to the needs of someone else, to the point where we no longer matter. Because if we are not meeting their wants and needs, it is a threat to our own safety. So we also learn these patterns through these kinds of relationships and dynamics. So, what kinds of experiences or patterns are your performance of goodness rooted in? And how does it serve you to be the martyr or the savior? Because again, like I just explained with this dynamic of it's how I'm ensuring my own safety, right? Everything that's in the shadow is self-protective. So, how does it actually serve me to be a martyr or to be a savior? Is it because that's what makes me feel worthy of love? Is that how I am seeking validation or recognition? Is this how I am setting myself up to be needed by someone so that I feel worthy, useful, productive? So, what am I gaining from these behaviors, these dynamics, these states of mind? How is it actually serving me to play the role of martyr or savior? And in what ways am I giving up my own personal power through these roles? What am I actually losing? In what ways is my self-sovereignty being compromised through martyrdom or saviorism? And in asking yourself all of these questions, I would then challenge you to ask yourself, which of these qualities or these patterns or the beliefs do I most dislike about myself? Where am I now judging myself or criticizing myself or worrying that I am bad and not good? And I would challenge you to write those parts of yourself a love letter, acknowledging why it was important for you to take on that role, how it served you, and also with so much love and compassion, be clear with yourself about how it does not serve you or others anymore. And how might you want to make different choices that are more honoring of your humanity and the humanity of those you're in relationship with? And next week, I'm going to talk about how this shows up in systems. So we are internalizing these ways of being through our conditioning, which is coming through systems of oppression. But then we are also recreating oppressive systems because we are unaware of the shadow side of these qualities and these characteristics. And so actually international development and humanitarian aid, for me, that is like the prime example of where this is playing out in ways that are really harmful, really extractive, really exploitative. But most people within those systems think that they are doing very good things. And I'm not saying that there is no good happening, but there is more often more harm than good being done. And I am going to unpack that and why that is, and how international development and humanitarian aid are inherently neo-colonial. Because these harmful practices have been masked as goodness. And so many people within that system are unable to see the ways in which what they are doing is actually harmful. And so next week, we'll talk about how this is really showing up in our collective experience, the ways that martyrdom and saviorism cause harm globally. And so for today, I would just invite you to reflect on the ways in which you might be harming yourself or others through the roles of martyrdom and saviorism. And I want to remind you again to have a lot of grace, compassion, and love for yourself in this process of reflecting on this. Because this is not about pointing to the ways in which you are actually bad. It is about bringing awareness to the ways in which we have been taught to think of ourselves as less than, and the ways in which we are then trying to compensate for our perceived lack. And inherent in this whole message is the fact that you are actually whole and worthy as you are, and you do not need to perform goodness to prove that you are deserving of love, to prove that you are useful, to prove that you are enough. You, as you are enough. And so is the person next to you, and over there, and over there. We are all enough as we are. And so how do we start to honor our enoughness rather than trying to prove it? And I'll see you next week for a conversation on how this plays out for us collectively.